Okay, you ready?
Yeah.
So, hello everybody. Welcome to the today's session, which is actually the second part of a presentation Mukesh already did one for us, and thank you very much for being here again. Stage is yours. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for the opportunity. So the last session that we did was how do you be creative on demand? Now, it is not just enough for us as individuals to be creative on demand. It is also important to have a culture that supports the creativity that we bring to the play. So today we will talk about how do you create a culture that supports creativity and therefore enables us to bring about innovation. But before we even start, right? So how do we define culture? So maybe if you would like to make a try on the chat as to how do you define culture. Let's just give a couple of minutes so that I would like to see how people on the call define culture. I'm assuming that people can put on their can respond on the chat, right? Shail?
Yes, they can type into the Q&A. They can type in questions or whatsoever.
Okay, so no problem. So the question is, how do you define a culture? This is one of those terms which everyone that you speak to comes up with a very different response to. It's very ambiguous. At times, it feels as if touchy-feely stuff, which nobody knows how to control, nobody knows how to measure, nobody knows how do you create one. So here are two definitions that I would like to bring into play here. So the first one is from Merriam-Webster Dictionary. So it says culture is defined as the set of shared attitudes, values, goals, and practices that characterizes an institution or an organization. It could be a group of people as well, right? So every one of these words which I've highlighted in different colors are important. It is a set of shared attitudes, right? So number one, it is a set. It's not just one attitude or two attitudes. It's a set of attitudes which go together. It's shared attitudes, which means that it is common across the institution or organization or the set of people. And it's attitude, values, goals, and practices. All four of them, right? And that characterizes an institution or organization, which means that it also, once you understand the culture of the organization or the institution, you can very much predict what kind of actions you will see that the organization takes. Now, this is the technical definition of what a culture is. There is a more popular and a more practical definition of what a culture is, which is defined by Seth Godin. Seth Godin is a best-selling author. He's written more than 20 books and is considered to be one of the most foremost authority when it comes to marketing. So he has this very simple phrase which says, "People like us do things like this," is how he defines culture. In this, I think you can assume uh, most of what we think of as culture can be addressed by just this one simple sentence. So number one, it's about people. It's not just about any people, it's people like us, right? So which is the group of people. Do, which means that it is there is an action involved. There are things that we do, and we do it like this, right? So in a particular way. So that is how culture works. Typically, you will find that people who are part of a culture behave in a certain way. They talk in a certain way, they move in a certain way, they think in a certain way, and so that's the next. If you really want to break this down, really in terms of very simple things that can help us understand what kind of culture are we in, what is it that culture really means broken down into the most simplistic form. It's going to be this. It's what we see. What are people wearing, how do they interact with each other, is there the dress that their people are wearing, is Is that formal? Is that casual? What is it that you look around in your environment? Are there free food available? Is there a beanbag available? Is there a space which is conducive for people to come and meet, talk together, or what else? So everything that you see is part of the culture. The second step is, what do you hear when you enter a meeting for the first time, or when a let's say a visitor comes into your team meeting? What does he hear? That's also part of a culture, right? So does he hear people being formal to each other? Does he hear banter? Does he hear people backslapping each other? See and hear people being really friendly, open? Does he hear people being guarded in whatever they are saying? So that also defines or tells us what kind of culture is prevalent in that particular community or team. And then transactions, or what do we do and how do we do them, right? So these are some things like, for example, do you copy your manager on every email that you send out? That tells a culture which is either the person is really new in the organization, so the manager wants to have a look at what he is doing, or if the person is really been in the system for a long time and he still needs to do that, that tells us a little bit about the culture in the prevalent in the team. And if everyone in the team does that, that tells a very different kind of a culture that is prevalent in the team as well, right? So what we see, what we hear, what we do. If you go one level deeper, so if you actually look at this, we are going deeper and deeper into what culture is. So first thing that comes to mind is what we see, then what we hear, then how we do stuff. Then comes, how do we think? So do we think in a way which is which kind of feels like everyone thinks the same way, or is there diversity in thinking? Do we think of ourselves first and saving our own backs first before doing anything else? Are we able to think out of the box? Are we able to think creatively? Are we constrained in our thinking by what is our culture in terms of what is allowed, what is not allowed, what can be done, what cannot be done, and things like that? And the last layer of the onion, if you have to peel it really down, is what we believe in. Do we believe that we are here and we bring in the best of what we can offer? Do we believe in us as a team, or do we believe that we are in a place where we have to, each one of us has to take care of ourselves first before we can think of the team, before we can think of the company, before we can think of the customer? So that's the onions if you peel, and the combination of all of this is what is the culture of the organization, right? So now, if we have to put all of this together, what I think is there are 6 kinds of culture that I have seen play out in organizations. So let's look at each one of them for a bit, right? So if you think of this as a car speedometer, right? Dial which kind of moves from one end of the spectrum to the other end of the spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum is a kind of culture which is conspiratory, which means that there is absolutely zero trust. What we say we will do and what we do are totally different things. Each one is looking at how can they make sure that they are safe before anything else. Everyone, there are people in the organization, in the team, which are actively working against what the team is trying to achieve as a team, right? So there are people conspiring against the team itself. So that's the conspiratory culture. So that's the far left end of the spectrum. So if you go a little bit next on the spectrum is combative cultures. So what do I mean by combative cultures? Combative cultures these are not people who are going behind your back and trying to sabotage what the team is trying to achieve or what someone is trying to achieve, but this is on your face. There are people who are open and doing so challenge you openly and are against what you're trying to do. openly, combative, right? The third kind of culture is compliant, which means if you ask me to do something, I will do it. I will not take any initiative. I don't have trust in you. So you'll have to actually actively ask me what you want me to do and put it on an email so that tomorrow, if something happens, I can pull out the email and show it to you that it is you who asked me to do this. So that's the compliant culture where it is all top driven. So whatever the boss asks me to do, I will do. And that's about it. I will not do anything more than that, is what is the compliant culture. Then we move into the positive territory. If you actually look at it as a ladder, this is where is above the line and below the line. Above the line is getting positive and better. Below the line is always harmful and negative from that point of view. So the next step in the evolution in terms of the spectrum of the different kinds of culture is cooperative, which means that I am okay to work with you. I have enough trust that I am okay to cooperate in whatever you are trying to do. So though I will still not take initiative, I will still not go with what I think is the right thing to do. I will still not lead unless the manager or the boss asks me to. But if the boss wants to do something, or if the manager wants to do something, or if the team wants to do something, I'm more than happy to help, right? And I might even offer help on my own without actually having been asked. It's still based on request and not necessarily proactive in nature. So the next in the spectrum is collaborative, which means that I'm more than happy to kind of work with you. I'm bringing more of myself into the action. I trust everyone around me working with me, and I'm more than happy to bring in more of my ideas. I'm happy to bring in more of my original thinking. I'm willing to bring more of myself to work with you and everyone else around me in a collaborative fashion. So this is where 1 + 1 becomes more than 2. It could be 3, it could be 5. But until this point in time, it is still mathematical equation. But collaboration actually increases the overall output of what everyone is trying to put in. So the last phase in terms of which is what I call as co-creative. This is when you have the full trust of the organization, of the team with you. Everyone trusts each other. Everyone is open. Everyone brings their best selves. Everyone is leading in their own way. Everyone is actually sharing what they think is the right perspective. Everyone is open. Everyone is honest. And everyone is wanting to create something which is much bigger than what they could have all done by themselves. So that's the spectrum of culture, right? And there are times when the same team can be one way or the other. Just like in a car, you can speed up and slow down. There are possibility that if you're not intentional about where you want to play, there is a good chance that you kind of slip down towards the negative territory. So which means that each one of us needs to be aware, not just aware, but be intentional about which field or which kind of culture we want to create from that point of view. So I'll stop here, and maybe my question to all of you is take a moment to think about what is the culture in your organization look like, in your team look like, in people around you. Do you trust them? If you have to label, where your team culture lies, if you can, please share it on the chat. If you can't, at least spare a minute to think about it and make a note of it for yourself. I'll just pause for a minute so that you can think about it and maybe make a note or put it on the chat as to where you think your team culture lies. It could be anywhere in between as well. It's not necessary that it has to be at one of these 6 stages, but it can be between these stages as well.
Yeah, type it in the Q&A. Yes.
Thanks. So I'll just wait for a minute.
Question from myself. Can you show the slide where this definition is on there from Guido, or how was his name?
Seth Godin.
Seth Godin.
Yeah.
Okay.
Correct.
While we're waiting for people typing in, you know what I asked myself? Do serial killers have a culture? Because they are people like them, do things like they like this.
Actually, they do, and that is how the law enforcement actually catches them, because they can predict the behavior.
Yeah. Good question. If you want to call it a culture.
Yeah.
Okay. Things coming in. You can read.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, so there is a question that comes up. Don't see much difference between compliant and cooperative, right? So compliant is I will do only what little you ask me to do. Trust is still in a negative territory, whereas in the cooperative, trust is slightly there, better trust, and I'm more than happy to do slightly more than what I'm expected to do. So that's the only difference between compliant and cooperative. And collaborative and co-creative. Okay. So co-creative is bringing your full selves. Collaborative is still holding and guarding a little bit. But I get your point. 4Cs could have been more sharper. In any case, it's a spectrum, right? So this is what I felt in terms of what I have seen. But point taken. Culture as a shock or a tipping point. Interesting. And the definition of culture is also pretty interesting that you've all put in. Yeah, Felix, I'm aware of what Erin Meyer talks about culture. And again, these are different lenses through which you can view them. That's one lens that definitely is very, very interesting to look at as well. Thanks for sharing that as well. And thanks, Andre, for sharing your team culture as well. At times, it always seems like an uphill struggle to move from one culture to the other. Now, the question then is, given that we know all of this, right? Given that we know 4 Cs or 6 Cs of culture, what can we do about it, right? So that's what we're going to maybe slightly talk about next. So in order to have a culture which supports creativity and innovation. So we're not just talking about culture now. So I'm talking about a culture that fosters creativity and therefore leading to innovation, requires a certain, has a certain kind of vibe to it or certain characteristics to it. So those characteristics are what we're going to talk about. And then we'll come back to all the different things that we can do in order to create a culture like that. So first and foremost, I do not know how many of you attended the last session, but in the last session, we spoke about the fact that it is important for us to find many dots to connect between. You need to have a lot of ideas and diverse ideas so that you can connect those ideas in order to create creative ideas. So that was the fundamental concept that we spoke about in the last session. So which means that in order to have a lot of those dots that we spoke about in the last session, we need to have increasing diversity. When I talk about diversity, it is all kinds of diversity. It's gender diversity, it's sexual diversity, which is male, female, others. It is diversity of thought, it is diversity of culture, it is diversity of perspectives. Increasing diversity is extremely critical in order to create a culture of that supports creativity and innovation. What that leads to is increasing conflict, because if you have people who are extremely diverse and have diverse perspectives and diverse thoughts and are open and ongoing conversation with each one of us, it typically will lead to increasing conflict. Now the question is, how do you manage that conflict, right? So in order to manage the conflict, you need extremely high levels of trust. So how do you get those high levels of trust? You need to have increased communication. Now, what do you communicate, right? So what is it that you will communicate in order to create the trust that we are talking about? And trust is not just about communication. It is also about saying and doing what you say. It is consistency in terms of whether or not you're doing what you say, whether or not what you say, what you mean, and what you do is in alignment. But that's, I'm assuming that we all understand what leads to high trust environment. But so here we need extremely high levels of trust, which is where we are leaning towards the co-creative culture that we spoke about in the previous slide. And what do you communicate? You need to be clear in terms of your expectations, and you continuously communicate the expectations. You continuously communicate clear sense of values. You need to continuously communicate clear sense of beliefs that we hold as a team, as an organization. Now, if you remember the definitions, those definitions also spoke about 3-4 things, right? So number one, it has to be collective. So which means that the entire expectations from each other, values that we are holding each other to, and the belief systems that we subscribe to needs to be common across the entire team and organization. And it is not just enough to have that once; it needs to be continuously communicated. High levels of trust needs to be continuously maintained, and high levels of diversity and high levels of trust put together helps us manage increasingly conflicting views. And that is what is super critical when it comes to breakthrough innovations coming out of a particular team, right? So so that's the core characteristics that every team which wants to create a culture that supports creativity and drive innovation needs to have. Now, let's look at space. At times, one example that I talk about when it comes to culture is if you take the analogy of a garden, right? So you take a fertile garden and you want to, let's say, for example, grow vegetables and flowers in that garden. Now, whether or not you like, whether you like it or not, there will be grass and weed growing along with what you want to grow, right? So it is, if you really want to have a clean, neat garden and the vegetables and flowers to thrive, you need to be willing to do the necessary effort to prune everything else that you don't want. Culture is like that. Whether you believe you have one, whether you believe you don't have one, there is always a culture that exists in the team. Where there are 4 people or 3 people, there is a culture. Now, it is up to us to be intentional about what kind of culture we want to build and how much effort we are willing to put in. Because each one of these steps is extremely high in terms of effort. And that is why it is important that you are intentionally putting in effort in order to do all of that. So now let's go to the environment that is required. So culture is also like the air that we breathe. The quality of it has an impact on our health, right? So which means that everything that surrounds us has an impact on us. And that's what the space is all about. So innovation happens when curiosity, creativity, and agency come together. Right at the center of all these 3 circles is where true innovation actually happens, right? So people who are curious find a problem, and people who are creative connect dots in order to solve the problem in a unique and new way. And the same set of people, if they have agency to do something about it, actually take the effort and do something about it, right? So that's what all of these 3 things coming together really mean. So there are 5 kinds of spaces that we need to be able to create within our teams in order for all these 3 things to thrive. So first one is what I call as temporal space. What do I mean by that? Do people have enough time in their calendars, in their schedule, in order for them to actually think and work on topics which can lead to innovation? Do they have time to be curious about something? Do they have time to actually sit down and think about the topics that they're curious and be creative about it? But all of this takes time, and time outside of your regular day-to-day work. So the day-to-day work cannot take a backseat, right? You need time, which is the temporal space. The second one is the cognitive space. Do people have enough cognitive bandwidth in order to actually think creatively and think deeply? Do they have emotional space? Do they have enough emotional, how do I put it, emotional strength or emotional, um, I'm struggling with the right word, but do they have, okay, so let me put it this way. Do they really care about what is happening in the work? Do they have emotional space for them to actually do something about what they're trying to do? And then, of course, agentic space, which is, do they have agency to do something? So that's what we talk about, which is, do people have enough time for them to take action on, to be curious about something? Do people have time to think creatively and deeply, which is what is the next one, which is, can people think deeply and creatively about what they're curious? Do people even care about their work, right? So there are so many different teams that I've seen, and unfortunately I've also been part of, where people don't care about what work they are doing. They just come in, they do their bit, and they just go back. It's just one way for them to take care of their families, to earn a decent living, so that they can go out and do what they really want to do, right? So it's also kind of, if people don't care about their work, typically you'll find that the culture is more and more towards the combative or conspiratory side of work, or maybe even compliant. They will do whatever is necessary, but that's about it. And then actually, can people act on their ideas? Do they need approvals? So how many levels of approvals is needed for them to kind of act at? I know, as a matter of, as an example, Adobe used to have this Adobe Idea Box. I do not know whether they still have it, but what they used to do was that if you have an idea which you really want to build upon, you just go to one of their internal portals, you sign in, and you say that you have an idea, and there is an innovation in a box. So you get a box which comes with a certain amount of dollars, which you can use for doing research. For example, Google AdWords research. There comes a training that you can attend on design thinking, and how do you do innovation, and how do you think creatively, and how do you identify problems and solve problems. And they get time for themselves to kind of work on the problem that they're trying to solve on. So that's one way to look at it, which Adobe does, which kind of actually addresses all four questions that I have on the slide. There is another company called Atlassian. What they do is they have these idea sprints, one weekend, 24-hour sprints on a regular basis, where what they say is, okay, this 24 hours is for people to work on those bugs or those problems which they see all around them, but they are not able to solve because of their day-to-day work. So they create teams, and within those 24 hours, 24-hour periods, they can actually come out and solve those nibbles that they have challenges or issues with, which they are not able to solve as part of their day-to-day work, and address them as part of those sprints. And they, at the end of the day, they actually present what they have done, and whichever team has done the best work kind of gets a prize, and they all have a lot of fun doing all of that. Plus, there are other startup organizations where, of course, startups by definition, they're small teams, and by definition, they have agency, because it's the small team and the founding team. They have the agency to do whatever they want to do. They are curious and creative. That is the reason why they have started up their own startups. In large organization, the challenge is we need to constantly and intentionally create all these 4 spaces. And it is not just enough to have all these 4 spaces. The last one is about the physical space itself. Whether the physical environment that you are in allows for you to come together and do all of this thinking in terms of curiosity, in terms of creativity. Does the physical space allow you to do all of that? That's one of the reasons why, if you have attended a design thinking training, there is a big emphasis on the physical space in which the entire teams work. The ability to quickly, rapidly prototype, the ability to quickly move and rearrange your space is also very, very important for all of these 3 things to come together. So I'll stop there for a second and ask you on the question on the chat or in the questions Q&A section. Can you think about this and tell me on the Q&A, of all these 5 spaces, which space do you think is lacking in your team, and which space you think you have enough of in your team? So you can just respond saying that enough and then hyphen what space you have enough of, lacking hyphen and put what space you think is lacking in your team when you think about it from that perspective. And yes, diversity is a two-edged sword, as I said. Diversity leads to conflict. Diversity leads to multiple perspectives. So as it only works as long as everyone agree that it is the problem that we are trying to solve which is more important, rather than the people who come up with different perspectives. And we'll talk about that little later when I come to the recommendations slide, which is just in a bit. Thanks, Michael, for asking the question. Which space is lacking? Let's see. Answer for those for that question first. Is there a synonym for agency? Agency is the ability to act, the power to act on your own. That's what agency is. If you actually look at the work done by Daniel Pink, he talks about agency as one of the most important aspects of people feeling empowered. So that's probably the closest that I can think of as a synonym for agency. Are people empowered to take action on the insights that they get as part of their work? Nice. So time seems to be always a constraint. Thanks for sharing that. Anyone else? Cognitive and emotional. Nice. So emotional is what you have enough of, and agentic is enough of. Cognitive and emotional space, not enough of. Yeah. So the first step in creating this culture and creating this agency is to self-diagnose, right? And if you are managers and leaders of team, and you need to be having a conversation with your team to check with them what is it that they think is lacking, and what is it that they think there is enough of, so that you can actively and intentionally start working on creating that space inside of your team and for your team members, so that they can actively think and start taking action. Now, it is not just enough to have these space. These space is critical, but it is also important to enable the curiosity, to feed the curiosity, to feed the creativity. How do you do that is something that we'll come to in just a moment as recommendations that I have for the next set of topics. Lacking agency, okay. Enough of agentic space, but not enough of cognitive and emotional. So you can see by the responses itself, right? So different teams can have different strengths within the same organization. And even within the same team, you will find that some people feel that they have enough agency on their own, and some people do not have enough agency. So for example, if you ask me, the team that I work for, I have 100% agency. I have the relationship that I have with my manager, with my boss, is that I only go to my manager if I've tried everything that I could, and I couldn't still address what needs to be addressed, and only then do I go back to her. And she has enough confidence in me and the work that I do, that she is open and she has given me the agency to do whatever is needed and necessary. Whereas the same thing might not be the case for some of my other colleagues as well. So even within the team, you need to be careful, intentional about what exactly do people need from all these four spaces to be precise, fifth physical spaces of course. It's always a challenge now, given that we are in a COVID time frame where everyone is working from home. So how do you create a culture when it comes to how do you create space for all of this when it comes to being virtual, right? So when you cannot meet, when you cannot see and talk to people from that point of view, is a totally different topic and a very, very vast topic by itself. So let's just move to the next set, which is the recommendations that I have. We will go through each one of them and kind of, I'll stop there and open it up for questions. So as the doctors take the Hippocratic Oath, right? So the first, do no harm. So that's exactly what we need to do as well as leaders and as managers of, and as the owners of culture. We need to make sure that we first do no harm. What do I mean by do no harm? Do not deplete trust. Do not say something and then do something else. Do not do anything that puts people or makes people, how do I put it, in a negative frame of mind, which kind of moves everyone towards the compliant or combative culture from that point of view. Hands up and hands down mindset. So what do I mean by hands up and hands down mindset? If you actually put a hands up, if you put your palm up, my video is not on, but hands up is the gesture of giving, and hands down is the gesture of taking. So any culture where people take more than they give is always going to have a struggle. And more so when it comes to managers. So if managers and bosses take more than they give, it is always going to be a challenge. So as managers and as first level managers, even more, it's my strongest belief that the entire organization's culture is defined and determined by the first level managers, because as first level managers, we are the ones who actually manage and work with and set the culture of the teams which actually do the work, right? So everyone above the first level manager is kind of putting together and getting the work aligned, if for the lack of better word. But the actual people who are actually doing the work on the ground, whether it is the sales guys, whether it's support guys, whether it's the development guys, whether it is the customer success guys, those are the guys who are actually day in, day out working with customers or working on code or selling. And the first level managers at that level determine the culture of the entire organization, because that's what customers actually see. So we need to be more of hands up mindset, which means that we need to be willing to serve our team as the managers rather than take more from our team. There is a very interesting book by Dr. Jennifer Mueller. I'll share the name of the book in a bit. Creative Change is the name of the book. She talks about the fact that everyone wants creative insights and creativity and innovation in their organization. Everyone says that they want, but in reality, when you come up with a really creative solution, when you come up with a really innovative solution, it gets shut down. How many of you have seen or experienced that? right? I've seen and experienced that multiple times in my 2.5 decades of working both in SAP and outside of SAP. I've seen that outside and customer organizations as well. That's because while cognitively we may want to see innovation, we understand the importance and criticality of innovation and creativity. Our limbic brain, or our system one, as Daniel Kahneman talks about, does not want anything that is new, because anything new can potentially trigger a survival mechanism in our body. So we generally stay away from new. So that's why they say that if you really have something new, when you're pitching that, you need to be able to relate it back to something that people know already. That is the only way that it gets accepted in the entire scenario. So now, why am I talking about all of this? All of that here is what if versus how best mindset. One mindset is all about execution. So how best can we implement this? How best can we, do X, Y, and Z? Is all about implementation, right? It's all about implementation. What if is all about imagination, creativity, and curiosity, and innovation. So as managers, it is our responsibility, or for that matter, even if you're not a manager, but if you're part of the team, it is our responsibility to stay in the what if mindset more at the start of any innovation journey, or any when you are trying to look at a problem, rather than how best. So there is a time for what if mindset, and there is a time for how best mindset. Uh, but truly creative and innovative cultures spend a lot of time in what if mindset rather than how best mindset. The fourth recommendation is flex your muscles to build them before you need them. This is very similar to one of the proverbs that we have in India. Is that the time to dig a well is not when you are hungry, when you're thirsty. It's 10 years before that, or 5 years before that, right? So what you need to do is you need to be able to build in the ability to be curious, build in the ability to be creative, build in the ability to take action at a smaller scale every day, every week, in every way possible. So that when you come to a position where you are trying to solve a problem, or when you're trying to be innovative, it does not sound like new. So you cannot just simply one fine day they put a team together and say, okay, now think creatively or think innovatively. We want innovation. It doesn't work like that. Just like any other muscle, the ability to think, to be curious, the ability to think creatively, and the ability to connect things takes time and effort and practice. And just like any other muscle, any muscle that you build over a period of time, you need to flex this muscle as well, and this culture that you need to create as well, in order to be ready for when the day arrives when you need it. Someone in the chat had mentioned, when I asked about what do you think of culture, or how do you define culture, they spoke about rituals, right? So these are very, very important when it comes to building a culture. So what are some of the rituals that you can have? So one ritual, for example, could be, every team meeting starts with a 15-minute or a 10-minute exercise, which is for curiosity. Or every team meeting starts with someone sharing what they've learned during the weekend or the last week. Or it could be every Monday when we do a stand-up, we start with XYZ. Or every Friday before we end the day, we do XYZ. So these rituals, which can then embed, which can embed what you really want to do and what muscle you want to build over a period of time, is how you kind of flex your muscles in order to build that culture. Stories are a great way of ensuring that everyone is aware of what core values we have, what is the belief system we have. And if you remember in the previous slide, I spoke about the characteristics that we need to have in order to have a culture. And one of the important facets is increasing communication of your core values, belief systems. Stories is one way of telling that. So, for example, there is this store called Nordstrom in the US. It seems that the stories that they tell within their organization, they are known for customer service. They don't sell tires, but if a customer brings a tire to their store and said, "I bought it from here, I don't want it anymore, and I want to exchange it for something else," they are more than willing to do that as well. I do not know how far that is true, but that's the story that they tell themselves. Another example of stories being extremely powerful in organizations is Southwest Airlines. They tell stories about how people actually went about creating saving money for their organization, right? They create legends out of them. They want to be the lowest cost airline in the world. So any and all decisions is looked at from that lens. So they keep telling stories about how employees went beyond their call of duty to save money for their organizations. So these stories then become legends, and that, when continuously told again and again, it kind of leads to that the quote from Seth Godin, right? People like us do things like this. It kind of embeds itself within your psyche, and that is important. Regular pruning is extremely important. As I said, garden, if you really want it to be neat and intentional, you need to be intentional about it. You need to weed out everything else that you don't like. It is very, very important to do that. Hire, fire, promote, recognize based on the cultural fit. So if you are hiring someone, you need to make sure that they understand what the culture is. So for example, Netflix, when they hire, they send out their culture deck to everyone, and they are supposed to read it and only appear for an interview if they agree to the culture deck that they have, and they live by that culture deck. So whatever is there in the culture deck, that is how they live. And in terms of values and beliefs, the other thing that is very important is to look at real life scenarios where people will have to make decisions, and tell people that, no, if you face XYZ decision, you need to go left or right. You need to go left. You could do both, but here our culture expects you to go to left every time. So when you're onboarding new employees, you need to have those real life examples, and then tell them what is it that you want them to do, and that can be done through stories as well. So you promote, you recognize, and you fire people based on their ability to enhance and add to the culture. And of course, from a creativity and innovation perspective, one of the most important things that managers and leaders can do is to create the guardrails within which you want the employees and the team members and colleagues to be curious and creative, and take agency around. So that's the job of the managers and the leaders. And last but not the least, culture is everybody's responsibility. If we all agree that this is the kind of culture that we want, and if we see someone doing something which is not conducive to that culture, you need to call them out. And that's a very, very important part of culture. It is not the manager's responsibility. It is everybody within the culture whose responsibility it is to make sure that we are able to retain the kind of culture that we want to create, and that's everybody's responsibility. I'll stop there, and that's all I had prepared for today. I wanted to have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So any questions?
So that makes it now a bit difficult, because we have so many things in the chat or in the Q&A. So let's see if we can go through. So let me look for a first question we have there. Okay, I have one. These 6 types of culture make sense for business teams, but we also think of culture for a country/social group. Do they still make sense?
Not necessarily. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But today's context that I had in mind was from an organization or a team perspective. Culture, again, as I said, you can look at culture from different lenses. What you are talking about is from an anthropological lens, which is slightly different from what I spoke about. I know Erin Meyer's stuff. She also looks at it from an anthropology perspective. So I think someone actually shared a link on the chat of the work that she has done. So that's probably a better fit from an anthropological perspective.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Can the team culture vary? Sometimes it is more co-creative, sometimes more collaborative.
Absolutely. If you remember the entire concept of this was like a speed dial, right? So it's like a car speedometer. So depending upon the speed at which the car goes, it kind of goes left to right. Same way, the culture in the organization can also, the same team can also vary depending upon the trust levels at that point in time. And if it is not intentional, if the team is not intentional in maintaining a specific kind of culture, then the variance is much higher. So some days it could feel like you are collaborative, some days it could feel like you are combative. The topic also matters. So that's the reason why I kind of tried to depict this as a dial, so which can go either ways depending upon the situation that you are in. Hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. The next one, a comment you might answer or comment on. So comment. Diversity is a two-edged sword. It must be managed variously at different levels in the organization at different times and need. Diversity makes convergence difficult for impactful leadership.
Absolutely right. I did talk about this a little bit when I was actually presenting as well. Diversity is a double-edged sword for sure, because if you do not manage it well, it can lead into various problems. Now, for you to have a really diverse team, it becomes super critical that the manager is also able to create a high trust environment. Because if you don't have a high trust environment and if you have diversity in the team, it is of no use, because the diversity will not come through, will not shine through, which means that having a diverse team doesn't help in what you are trying to do as well. So extremely intentional you need to be about managing diversity, because having diverse perspectives, diverse age group of people from different age group, from different genders, from different ethnicities, from different races, from different cultures, from different thinking, creates a lot of how do I put it, conflicts. And if you're not able to manage that conflict well, you are in for a rough time. So I completely agree to what you said.
Okay, thank you. Next question. As you refer to design thinking, there may be an additional space, perspective space. Do we have the right mix of people in the space?
Yes, you are right. I had covered that as part of the characteristics that we spoke about, but you're right. The perspectives is very important, and having different perspectives is what will actually lead to a highly curious bunch of people, which can then lead to highly creative ideas, which when acted upon can lead to innovation. Absolutely right.
Okay, thank you. Next one, I don't understand right. It might be out of the context. I'll give it a try. How about curiosity? Isn't this a central energy to go for innovative perspectives?
Absolutely right. So if you actually look at the way I've put together this slide, and this is not my personal work, by the way. This is something that I've learned from someone as well, and added my perspective to it. So if you look at it, the most central aspect of this entire model is curiosity, creativity, and agency. Without curiosity, you will not have the different perspectives which is needed for innovation to happen. It is an absolute must.
Okay, thank you. Next question. When you're trying to be collaborative or co-creative in a combative team, you will probably drown. How can you, as a team member, change the culture of a team? Or should you rather just leave the team and look for a better working environment somewhere else?
It's a great question. That's a long winded answer, because it's not easy trying to be co-creative and or collaborative in a combative team, but it's not impossible either. Now, in that case, what you need to do is to find allies. So do you think in your team, in that team, in the combative team that you're looking at, are there allies who also want the same thing that you want, which is to build a culture of co-creation or collaboration? If you have allies, if you can find allies, then you need to come together and start working towards making the cultural shift. And especially if your boss or if the manager on the team is aligned with you. If the manager is not aligned, and if usually when there is a cultural problem, my first reaction is to look at who the manager is and what their style of management is. So if the manager is not open and is not willing to work with you to change the culture in the organization or in the team, then it's very, very difficult to make any change. In that case, it's better to move out and go to a different team. But if the manager is willing to change, then there is a whole lot of things that you can do to create to shift the culture. I can deliver I have trained a set of people on leading large scale transformations. Culture transformation is the most difficult one. So easiest is policy. Policy to maybe it's easy to change process. Slightly more difficult is to change the system. Slightly more difficult it is to change how people act. Slightly more difficult is to change how people believe, and the most difficult to change is the culture. So if it is of interest, I can do a follow-up session where I can talk about how do you lead large-scale transformation.
Okay, thank you. So wait, get the next question. How can new employee can change the culture, positive change of the team? But you might have answered this already. So next question. The Netflix example of a culture manual, does this make it too rigid and not engender change and development?
That depends. That depends on what you are trying to accomplish. Culture. Okay, let me say it this way. Within the confines of what they define as their culture, there is still a lot of leeway, and there is a lot of potentialities and probability and potential for the organization and the people who are working in the organization to develop. So it is always important to define your culture in a way saying that, okay, this is us and this is not us. This is our culture, this is not our culture. Unless that clarity exists in the minds of everyone in the team, it's very difficult to tell that you have a particular culture. And the more clearer it is, the more you will find people are able to inculcate the culture in their own actions and in their own activities. So it is important to have that, I'll not say rigidity, but I will say limits or boundaries.
Okay, so time almost over. Let's take the last question. There will always be culture. So a currency with a culture value binding never will get zero?
I'm not sure I get the question, but let me try and see if I can rephrase the question and answer that question.
Mm-hmm.
So, if I understand correctly, what the question means is that since there will always be a culture, If you equate the culture to a currency, then the currency value will never be zero. You're right. So there is always a culture, whether you like it or not, whether you are intentional about it or not, whether you actually create the culture that you want or not, there will always be a culture. Forget about organization, forget about teams. There is always a culture in your family as well. So the way you behave, the way whether you eat your breakfast together, whether you have your dinner together, whether you play together, whether how often do you meet with your parents. All of that is still a culture. You're not deliberate about it, but there is still always a culture. So the idea here is, if we really want to foster innovation and creativity, it is important that we are intentional and deliberate about the kind of culture that we want to build, so that creativity, curiosity, agency, and therefore innovation can thrive in our organization. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. Time over. Thank you very much for doing the session. Thank you very much to everybody attending the call. Thank you. See you next time, and goodbye.
Thanks for the opportunity. I hope it was useful, helpful. Thank you.